In this video, I'm going to repair this hole in the wall using what's called a California patch, otherwise known as a butterfly patch. So I'm going to show you how I make one of these patches and how it works. The first thing I need to do is measure a square around the hole. The square doesn't need to be perfect, just a rough square. So what I'm looking at is about 3 inches vertically and about 3 inches horizontally. The next thing I'm going to do is draw out the measurements of that square onto the back side of a piece of drywall. Again, it doesn't need to be a perfect square, just roughly square using the measurements that were taken. Now I could use a T-square if I wanted to have a perfect square, but just using a ruler will be sufficient, or a tape measure and a straight edge. After I've drawn out that square, what I'm going to do next is draw another square about 1 inch wider than the first square. Next, I'll take a utility knife and I'll cut out the perimeter of the wider square. Now, as demonstrated, I will cut into the piece of drywall following the perimeter of the first square. I'll be aiming to cut about halfway to 3/4 of the way through the piece of the drywall, so this can take several passes with the knife. I will also cut diagonally at the corners just to help it break easier, but this part isn't completely necessary. After having made deep cuts into the drywall, I'm going to snap along those cut lines, and then I'm going to peel off the drywall, leaving the white face paper intact. The next thing I'm going to do is trace the patch onto the wall. But first, I'm going to draw an arrow on the patch so that I know the orientation of the patch onto the wall. I'll make sure that my patch is aligned perfectly with the hole, and then, as demonstrated, I'll trace around the patch. After that, I'm going to cut along the traced lines and take out that square. The good thing about tracing the patch is that now the patch will friction fit into the hole. Before going on to the next step, check and make sure that the patch fits. I'm using an all-purpose drywall compound. This is how I mud in the drywall patch. I like to work with an excess of drywall compound. That way it ensures that there's no air bubbles and that there's good contact of mud to really cement in that patch. So I put in the mud around the hole, and then, as I'm demonstrating here, I put mud in right inside the hole, just like kind of what I'm showing. And then I just smooth it out. And also, as I'm demonstrating here, I also put drywall compound onto the patch, just like this. This ensures that the patch is well cemented in there and that there's no air pockets or air bubbles. So the next step is to push the patch into the hole, and then I'm using my fingers just to press it in a little bit. And then I'll start wiping out the excess compound. So the goal is just to get it flat with the wall. This can take several passes with the knife, and I'll just keep passing over it until I'm satisfied that it's very flat and very flushed with the wall. The next step, and this next step isn't completely necessary, it's just something that I do, is that as part of the embedding coat, I will also just push some mud over it like this, and then I'll wipe it right off. And this part just helps speed up the following coats just a little bit. So it's now been 24 hours of drying, so I'm going to put on what I call the loading coat. The goal here of this first loading coat is to just get as much compound on as I can, so that the finish coat can be a tighter coat. So I'm just going to put it on like that, try to smooth it flat, and then I'm going to work the sides to kind of skim off the edge like that. Now, as I'm doing that, I'm trying to preserve the thickness of the compound in the middle. Not too thick, you don't want it bumped up, but just thick enough that you don't see that patch underneath. So that has dried now for 24 hours. So I'm going to use this sanding sponge and I'm going to sand it down. The goal here is just to sand off those ridges, and I'm concentrating in the middle just to get those ridges off and flatten it out just a little bit. And then it's going to be ready to put on the finish coat. Okay, so now I'm going to put on the finish coat, and I'm going to be using a wide knife for this, and I've also thinned down the drywall compound just a little bit, just enough to help it spread. So what I'm doing here is I'm doing a really wide overlap, and then I'm just taking most of it off. I don't need to leave too much compound behind at this stage because the previous coat I left most of the compound that I need. That's why I call it the loading coat. So this next coat is just the finish coat. The goal here is just to smooth it off into the wall. It's also to smooth out any little imperfections and just to make it easier to sand. Okay, so this is the next day again, and it's completely dry. So now I'm gonna sand it with the sanding sponge. Because I did a really nice tight coat on that finish, I don't really have a whole lot to sand. I'm just going to be concentrating mostly in the middle and just kind of looking for any little bumps or ridges and just generally smoothing it out. But I don't need to take off too much. I also don't want to take off too much around the edge because that's the area that helps blend it into the wall. So when I'm sanding, I'm mostly just concentrating in the middle and just generally just kind of smoothing it out and making sure that it feels flat and that it's not going to be seen once I paint it. So now with the sanding completed, I'm going to paint it. So I'm going to use a 4-inch roller to begin with, and I'm going to start in the middle and just work my way out. What I'm going to be doing here is I'm just going to paint the patch first, and then I'm going to let that dry, and then I'm going to take a 9-inch roller and I'll paint the entire wall afterwards. But I only want to do one coat over the whole wall, so this patch needs 2 coats. So what I'm going to do is just spot paint the patch here as I'm doing. I'll let that dry, and then I'll just paint the whole wall, and then it'll be finished. You don't have to paint the whole wall, but in my experience, you can kind of always see where you've painted a patch, and so the best way is just to paint the whole wall, and then the whole wall is uniform and you can't ever tell that there was a patch there. But with a flat paint, you could maybe get away with just painting the patched area, but this is an eggshell paint, so I'm going to paint the whole wall once I'm done here. Okay, so that summarizes the video. I hope you found that helpful, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel. I'll be making lots more little videos like this. Okay, thanks for watching.